In May 1990, inside a quiet room at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, the machines were louder than the people. Sammy Davis Jr. was dying. His voice, once unstoppable, had been reduced to breath and effort. Outside the door, a man stood motionless, his hand hovering inches from the handle. It was Dean Martin, the one friend who never came to hospital beds, the man who never said goodbye. And if he walked in now, what could he possibly say that would arrive in time? What happened in that hospital room was never meant for the public. There were no cameras, no stage lights, no audience waiting to applaud. And that is exactly why it mattered more than anything Dean Martin or Sammy Davis Jr. ever did in their careers. For decades, their friendship had lived in performance. On stage, they laughed, teased, improvised. Off stage, they rarely spoke about what truly bound them together: fear, loyalty, and the quiet cost of surviving an era that demanded charm instead of honesty. Men like Dean were taught something simple and brutal. You don't talk about feelings. You show up, you joke, you pour another drink, and you move on. But death does not respect those rules. As Sammy's body failed him, what he needed was not another tribute or another famous visitor. He needed one thing that had been missing for most of his life: to hear clearly and unmistakably that he mattered, not as a performer, not as a symbol, but as a friend. This story endures because it exposes a truth many people recognize too late. Sometimes the hardest goodbye is not losing someone. It's finding the courage to finally say what was never said. To understand why that hospital door mattered so much, you have to understand the man standing outside it. Dean Martin built an entire life on effortlessness. On stage, he looked relaxed, half amused, as if success had simply wandered into his lap. But that image was carefully constructed. Dean's true discipline wasn't work ethic. It was emotional control. Among the Rat Pack, everyone had a role. Frank was fire and force. Sammy was energy and heart. Dean was the calm center, the man who never seemed rattled, never seemed afraid. But that calm came at a price. Dean hated moments he couldn't manage. Hospitals, funerals, last conversations, anything that forced him to stand still while life ended in front of him. He didn't believe in dramatic goodbyes, not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much. People close to him knew the rule. Dean doesn't do deathbeds. Dean doesn't say farewell. If he walks away first, the pain stays contained. For decades, that rule protected him. Then there was Sammy Davis Jr. Their bond wasn't loud. It didn't need speeches. It lived in glances on stage, in timing so precise it looked like telepathy. When Sammy faced doors closed because of race, Dean rarely made noise. But contracts quietly changed. Dressing rooms suddenly opened. Hotels adjusted policies. Problems disappeared without press conferences. Dean never said, "I'm standing up for you." He just did it and expected no thanks. That was his language. But time has a way of stripping language down to its most basic form. By the late 1980s, Dean's carefully managed distance from grief was already cracking. The death of his son, Dean Paul, had left a wound that never healed cleanly. Friends noticed the change. He moved slower, spoke less, avoided places tied to endings. So when word spread that Sammy was dying, the old rule returned with force. Dean told himself what he always did. Sammy knows how I feel. We don't need words. Seeing him like that would destroy what we were. Meanwhile, Sammy lay in a hospital room where time behaved differently. Fame no longer mattered there. Applause had no currency. What remained were unfinished sentences. Visitors came and went, friends, legends, admirers. They brought memories, jokes, stories from better years. Sammy appreciated them. He smiled when he could. But one absence echoed louder than all the others. Dean hadn't come, and that silence cut deeper than anyone realized. Because for all their history, there was one thing Dean had never given Sammy directly: a clear spoken acknowledgement of what Sammy meant to him as a man. Not a partner, not a performer, not a member of the act. As Sammy's strength faded, hope became fragile. Each day that passed made the unspoken more permanent. And somewhere across the city, Dean Martin knew exactly what was at stake. He could protect himself one last time, Or he could walk into a room where charm meant nothing, where jokes would fail, and where words he had avoided his entire life, were the only thing that mattered. Outside that hospital door, Dean wasn't choosing whether to visit a friend. He was choosing whether to finally break the rule that had defined him. The parking garage was almost empty. Late afternoon light slipped through the concrete gaps, landing in pale stripes across the hood of the car. Dean Martin sat behind the wheel longer than necessary, his hands resting where they always had. Steady, practiced, still. He had driven past this hospital twice already. The first time he told himself he was too early. The second time that he was too late. Both were lies. Dean had played sold-out rooms in Las Vegas without a flicker of nerves, had faced hostile crowds, broken contracts, and personal disasters with the same unbothered half-smile. But none of that had prepared him for this moment. One building, one floor, one room where he would no longer be able to hide behind timing or charm. When he finally opened the car door, the sound echoed louder than it should have. Inside, the hospital smelled like antiseptic and recycled air. The floors shone too brightly, as if trying to deny the reality of what happened here every day. Dean nodded once at the front desk, gave his name quietly. No one asked for an autograph. No one smiled. Fame didn't travel this far down the hall. The elevator ride felt endless. As the doors closed, Dean caught his reflection in the metal paneling. For a split second, he didn't recognize the man looking back. The hair was thinner, the shoulders sat lower. The eyes, once playful, detached, now carried something unfamiliar. Fear, not of death, of words. The elevator chimed. Another floor. Another chance to turn back. He didn't. Each step down the hallway brought back memories he hadn't invited. Dressing rooms thick with cigarette smoke. Hotel corridors buzzing after midnight. A voice beside him, Sammy Davis Jr., laughing at nothing and everything at once. Dean had always believed some friendships didn't need explanation. That if you showed up night after night, if you stood beside someone when it mattered, that was enough. But here, standing in a place where time was measured in heartbeats, that belief felt dangerously thin. He slowed near the nurse's station, pretending to read a sign he'd already passed. A nurse glanced up, then away, sensing without asking that this man needed space. At the end of the hall, a door stood slightly ajar. Sammy's room. Dean stopped. For a long moment, he couldn't move. Behind that door was a version of his friend he had never seen before. Not the lightning-fast performer, not the man who commanded rooms. Just a body growing quieter by the hour. Dean thought of every time he had avoided this, every funeral he skipped, every goodbye he left unsaid. He told himself those choices were strength, that leaving first meant surviving, but now he understood the cost. Avoiding endings didn't make them easier. It only made them lonelier. A soft sound drifted from the room, not a voice. Just the steady rhythm of machines doing the work a body no longer could. Dean raised his hand toward the door handle. It hovered there. This was the point of no return. Once he stepped inside, there would be no jokes to retreat behind, no exits disguised as confidence. Whatever he said, or didn't say, would follow him for the rest of his life. He exhaled slowly, and then he opened the door. The room was dim, curtains half drawn, afternoon light resting gently across white sheets. Sammy Davis Jr. lay still, smaller than Dean remembered, the weight of decades gone from his frame. For a moment, Sammy didn't react. Then his eyes shifted. They focused. Recognition flickered, slow, fragile, unmistakable. "Dino," Sammy whispered, the sound barely there. Dean felt something tighten in his chest. "Hey, Smokey," he replied softly. "You look terrible." It was the kind of line that had carried them through a lifetime, a joke where love was hidden in the timing, and for a split second, it worked. Sammy smiled. The smile turned into a breathy laugh, then a cough. Dean stepped closer without thinking, pulling a chair to the bedside, suddenly afraid of how little time he might have left. They sat in silence. No stories, no memories yet. Just two men who had outrun this moment for decades, finally caught by it. Dean realized then that walking down the hallway had been the easy part. What came next would require something he had never learned how to do. Speak. For a long time, neither man said anything. The machines filled the silence, steady, indifferent, precise. Dean Martin sat close enough now to see how shallow Sammy Davis Jr.'s breathing had become. Each rise of his chest looked negotiated, as if his body were deciding whether the effort was still worth it. Dean had always believed silence could protect people, that if you didn't say the wrong thing, you couldn't cause damage, that feelings once spoken couldn't be taken back. But sitting there, he understood something too late. Silence doesn't protect anyone. It only delays the reckoning. Sammy's eyes stayed on Dean's face, searching, not for reassurance, but for honesty, the kind that didn't hide behind humor or history. "You came," Sammy whispered. Dean nodded once. His throat felt tight, useless. "Yeah," he said. "I did." Another pause. "I wasn't sure you would," Sammy said. There was no accusation in it, just fact. Dean looked down at his hands. Hands that had signed contracts, lifted glasses, waved off applause. Hands that had never once held a friend while saying goodbye. "I wasn't sure either," he admitted. That sentence alone felt like stepping off a cliff. Dean reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small and worn at the edges. A photograph. He held it carefully, as if it might fall apart if handled too roughly. It was an old image. 5 men on a stage, arms slung around one another, laughing at something the camera hadn't caught. A time when the future still felt endless. Dean angled it so Sammy could see. "I found this in my desk," Dean said quietly. "Been carrying it around for weeks. Couldn't decide what to do with it." Sammy stared at the photograph for a long moment. His eyes filled, not with sadness, but with recognition. "We were something," Sammy murmured. Dean swallowed. "We were everything." The word surprised even him. Sammy's breathing grew uneven. Dean set the photo gently on the bedside table, then leaned closer, not as a performer hitting a mark, but as a man who finally understood there were no second takes. "There's things I should have said a long time ago," Dean said. His voice wavered, then steadied. "And if I don't say them now, they're going to follow me forever." Sammy nodded, the movement barely visible. Dean stared at the floor as he spoke, as if the truth were too heavy to face directly. "I was never good with this stuff," he said. "Frank had speeches. You had heart. I had silence." A bitter half-smile flickered, then vanished. "I told myself that was enough." Sammy watched him closely. "When you were fighting things, I never had to fight," Dean continued. "The hotels, the rules, the looks. I saw how you handled it. You didn't harden. You didn't turn mean." His voice cracked. "You showed me what class actually looked like." Tears slid down Sammy's cheeks without sound. Dean finally looked up. "I want you to know something," he said. "Every stage I ever stood on with you, it meant something, not because of the applause, because you were there." Sammy's hand shifted weakly atop the sheets. Dean reached for it instinctively, wrapping his fingers around it before fear could stop him. "I didn't always speak up," Dean went on. "Didn't always do enough. Sometimes I hid behind jokes when I should have been louder." He shook his head slowly. "That's on me." Sammy squeezed his hand. "Just a fraction, but enough." "You were there when it mattered," Sammy whispered. "You always were." Dean exhaled, a sound halfway between relief and grief. "There's something else," he said. His voice dropped, almost afraid of the words themselves. "You saved me once." Sammy frowned slightly, confused. "Back when everything got messy," Dean said. "When I thought it was over. When I didn't know who I was, without all of it." He paused, memories pressing in. "I called you. You came. You sat with me until the sun came up. You reminded me why the music mattered." Sammy's eyes softened. "You kept me from walking away from everything," Dean said. "You kept me. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Dean leaned closer, his forehead nearly touching Sammy's. "I've spent my whole life avoiding goodbyes," he said. "Thought that made me strong." He swallowed hard. "The truth is, I was scared." Sammy's lips trembled into the faintest smile. "We all were," he whispered. Dean closed his eyes. "If you get where you're going first," he said quietly, "keep an eye out for my boy." His voice almost broke completely now. "He's probably lost." Sammy's grip tightened, just a little. "I'll find him," he said. "I promise." Dean bent down and pressed a gentle kiss to Sammy's forehead, an intimacy neither of them would have believed possible years earlier. "I love you, Smokey," Dean said. "I should have said it sooner." Sammy's tears flowed freely now, but his face was calm. "I know," he whispered, "and I love you too." Dean stayed for a long time after that, long enough for the machines to fade into the background, long enough for silence to stop feeling dangerous. When he finally stood to leave, the weight he had carried for decades felt different, not gone, but lighter. At the doorway, Dean turned back. "Next time I see you," he said softly, "you better be ready to sing." Sammy smiled. "I'll save you the good songs." 2 days later, Sammy Davis Jr. was gone. But the words Dean Martin finally spoke stayed behind. Proof that even the quietest men can change the ending if they speak before it's too late. 2 days later, Sammy Davis Jr. was gone. The room where he had spent his final hours returned to what hospitals do best, erasing traces of life. Fresh sheets, machines reset, another name prepared for the chart. But something had shifted before that door closed for the last time, and the people closest to Sammy felt it immediately. They said the fear had left him. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just quietly. After Dean Martin's visit, Sammy slept more peacefully. His breathing, though still labored, no longer carried the same tension. The waiting, the unanswered question, was over. He had received the one thing he had not asked for out loud, but had needed more than anything else: recognition, not from the world, from the one man whose approval had always mattered most. Dean did not speak publicly after Sammy's death. That surprised no one who truly knew him. He never turned private moments into performances. He attended the service quietly, standing apart from the cameras, offering no eulogies, no statements, no explanations. That was his way. But those closest to him noticed the difference. Dean was slower afterward, quieter, more deliberate. The jokes came less often, and when they did, they carried less armor. It was as if something long locked away had finally been acknowledged, and once seen, could no longer be ignored. Years later, when someone asked Dean about that final visit, he didn't describe the conversation. He didn't repeat the words. He simply said, "We said what needed to be said," and that was all. Among Sammy's belongings, one item remained on the nightstand after he passed. A photograph from decades earlier. 5 men on a stage, young and unbroken, laughing at a future they could not yet imagine. On the back, in Dean's handwriting, were a few simple words meant for no one else. They were not poetic. They were not dramatic. They were honest. That photograph eventually found its way into history, but the moment behind it never truly belonged there. It belonged to a quiet hospital room, to 2 men who had spent their lives speaking through performance, finally learning to speak as themselves. This is why the story endures. Not because of fame, not because of legend, but because it reminds us of something uncomfortable and universal. Most people don't regret the things they said. They regret the words they waited too long to speak. Dean Martin spent a lifetime mastering silence. But at the very end, he learned something more difficult. Silence has a cost. And sometimes the bravest act of all is breaking it before the door closes for good. Long after the headlines faded, people continued to debate the legacy of Sammy Davis Jr. They talked about his talent, his versatility, his place in American entertainment history. But almost no one talked about the quiet burden he carried. For most of his life, Sammy stood on stages where he was celebrated, but not always accepted. He smiled through rooms that applauded his talent while questioning his presence. He learned early that survival sometimes meant swallowing pain and turning it into performance. And he did it better than anyone. What makes that final hospital visit so powerful is not that Dean Martin showed up. It's why his presence mattered. Sammy didn't need another famous visitor. He didn't need reassurance from history or the industry. He needed confirmation that the man who stood beside him during the hardest years truly saw him. Not as the kid, not as the entertainer who could do it all, but as an equal. That recognition arrived at the very end, not because Dean withheld it out of cruelty, but because men of that era were taught a dangerous lesson, that respect should be shown indirectly, that love should be implied, and that words were optional. The tragedy is not that Dean waited too long. The tragedy is how many people live their entire lives believing silence is enough until time proves otherwise. Sammy's legacy is not only the music or the performances we still watch today. It is the reminder that dignity often comes not from applause, but from being truly acknowledged by the people who mattered most. There is a reason this story still lingers, because it isn't really about two legends. It's about a moment most people fear, the moment when there is no stage left, no role to play, no future version of yourself who will say it later, only now. Dean Martin spent decades mastering the art of deflection, humor, charm, silence. But in one quiet hospital room, he learned what none of those could do. They could not replace honesty. And Sammy Davis Jr., who had spent a lifetime performing for the world, received the one performance he never asked for, but needed most. A truth spoken too late, but not too late. That is why this story hurts, and that is why it matters. Because somewhere in the audience right now, someone is postponing a conversation. Someone is assuming another day will come. Someone believes the people they love already know. This story asks simple, uncomfortable question. If the door were about to close, what would you say? And more importantly, who are you still waiting to say it to?